On Veterans Day, while hundreds of people gathered to honor heroes, an old German shepherd stood alone far beyond the crowd, watching from the edge of the square. He was thin. He limped with every step. Yet he never looked at the flags, the families, or the ceremony. His eyes remained fixed on a single man standing on the stage. No one noticed the dog. No one except a former Navy SEAL named Griffin Cole. The moment Griffin saw those tired eyes, a feeling he hadn't experienced in 8 years came rushing back. Because somewhere beneath the dog's faded fur was a secret that should have died long ago. Weeks later, that same German shepherd would be found lying beside the grave of a forgotten soldier. A soldier erased from history, a soldier whose story had been stolen by another man. But how could a dog believed dead for nearly a decade return to expose the truth? And why did his appearance make a celebrated hero suddenly afraid? Stay with us until the end, because this extraordinary story will reveal how loyalty survived 8 years of silence, and how one old dog brought a fallen hero's name back home. If stories of courage, sacrifice, and second chances touch your heart, please like, subscribe, and join us on this unforgettable journey. The town of Crest Hollow, Virginia, woke beneath a pale November sky on Veterans Day. Cold wind drifted through the streets, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Flags lined the sidewalks. Families gathered near the town square. The annual memorial ceremony was about to begin, just as it had every year for as long as most people could remember. Griffin Cole stood at the edge of the crowd. At 45 years old, Griffin was a former Navy SEAL K-9 handler. Years ago, he had served in dangerous operations alongside military working dogs. Now he lived alone in a small house outside town and worked repairing engines and equipment for local businesses. Most people in Crest Hollow knew his name. Very few truly knew him. That was exactly how Griffin preferred it. He kept his hands buried in the pockets of his old jacket as he watched people move toward the stage in the center of the square. Children waved miniature flags. Veterans greeted one another with smiles and handshakes. Families took photographs. Griffin stayed where he always stayed, far from the stage, far from the cameras, far from the applause. 8 years. For 8 straight years he had come to this ceremony and stood in nearly the same spot. Every year he told himself the same thing. This is the year. This is the year I stop staying silent. This is the year I tell everyone what really happened. Yet every year ended the same way. He walked away, alone. The crowd suddenly erupted into applause. Griffin lifted his eyes toward the stage. There stood Callaway Voss. Callaway Voss, 58 years old, was a former military commander who had transformed himself into a respected public figure. Newspapers praised him. Television programs interviewed him. Veterans organizations honored him. To most people, he was the hero of Operation Black Ridge. The operation had become part of military legend, at least the version the public knew. Callaway smiled warmly as he approached the podium. Medals gleamed on his suit jacket. His voice carried easily across the square. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about courage. He spoke about loyalty. The crowd listened carefully. Griffin felt his jaw tighten. Loyalty. That word always bothered him. His eyes drifted away from the stage. For a moment, another face appeared in his memory. Stellan Merritt, 22 years old, the youngest member of their team, the one nobody remembered anymore, the one who should have been standing in every photograph, the one who should have been mentioned in every speech, the one who never came home. The memory arrived without warning, a cold night, a temporary camp, the distant sound of wind moving through rocky hills. Stellan sitting beside a small lantern, scratching behind the ears of his German shepherd partner. The dog had rested his head on Stellan's knee, while the young soldier quietly hummed an old song. "You know," Stellan had said with a grin, "if this team ever falls apart, Axel and I are starting our own." The others had laughed. Even Griffin had laughed. Axel had looked up at his handler with complete trust. Griffin remembered that moment more clearly than he remembered most of his own life, because it was the last peaceful night before everything changed. A fresh wave of applause pulled him back to the present. Callaway had finished another story from Black Ridge. The crowd loved it. Of course they did. They had never been told the truth. Griffin looked down at the pavement. For a few seconds he imagined walking forward. He imagined stepping through the crowd. Imagined taking the microphone. Imagined finally saying Stellan's name. But the familiar weight settled onto his shoulders. The same weight that had followed him for 8 years. The same doubt. The same exhaustion. What would it change? Who would believe him? The questions always won. His fingers slowly unclenched. Just like every year, Griffin turned away from the stage. The ceremony would continue without him. It always did. He started toward the edge of the square. Then he stopped. Something had caught his attention. A figure stood near the far end of the street beyond the crowd. At first he thought it was simply a stray dog. Then he looked closer. A German shepherd, old, very old. Its coat had faded with age. Gray fur mixed heavily through the black and tan coloring. Its ribs were visible beneath its thin frame. One of its hind legs moved awkwardly, forcing the animal into a slight limp. The dog looked tired. Not hungry, not frightened. Tired. People walked past it without paying much attention. The dog didn't approach anyone. It didn't beg. It didn't bark. It didn't wag its tail. It simply stood there, watching. Griffin frowned. Something about the animal felt unusual. Most strays searched for food. Most sought warmth. Most reacted when people approached. This dog did none of those things. Its attention remained fixed on the square, on the stage, on Callaway Voss. The dog stood perfectly still while the speech continued. A strange feeling settled in Griffin's chest. He couldn't explain why. The animal's posture seemed familiar somehow. Not physically, emotionally. The dog looked as though it had carried a burden for a very long time. The applause rose again. The dog never moved. Griffin found himself watching it instead of the ceremony. Minutes passed. The distance between them remained the same. Then, almost as if it sensed his attention, the German shepherd slowly turned its head. Their eyes met. Griffin had spent years around working dogs. He had trained with them, lived beside them, trusted them with his life. Yet he had never seen eyes quite like these. There was no excitement in them, no curiosity, no fear, only something deeper, weariness, disappointment, loneliness. The emotion struck him so suddenly that he almost looked away because he recognized them. He saw the same things every morning in his own reflection. The dog continued staring at him. Neither moved. Neither looked away. For one strange moment, standing in the middle of a crowded Veterans Day ceremony, Griffin felt as though he were looking at another soul that had somehow been left behind. The wind swept through the street. A flag snapped sharply overhead. The dog finally broke eye contact. Slowly, it turned away from the square, away from the stage, away from Callaway. Its limp was more noticeable now as it disappeared down the sidewalk. Griffin watched until the animal vanished beyond the corner of a brick building. Only then did he realize he was still standing there. The speech continued. The crowd continued applauding. But Griffin barely heard any of it. For the first time in years, his thoughts were no longer focused on Callaway Voss. They were no longer focused on Black Ridge. They were no longer focused on the truth he had failed to tell. Instead, he found himself thinking about an old German shepherd with tired eyes, and wondering why it had looked so much like him. The next morning arrived cold and gray over Crest Hollow. Thin clouds drifted across the sky, muting the sunlight and leaving the town wrapped in a quiet stillness. Griffin Cole woke earlier than usual. He stood in his kitchen holding a cup of coffee, staring through the window toward the road beyond his yard. He was thinking about the dog. The image had followed him home after the Veterans Day ceremony. It lingered through the evening and stayed with him when he lay awake in bed. There had been something in the animal's eyes that refused to leave his mind. By mid-morning, Griffin found himself driving toward the town park. He told himself he was only curious, nothing more. The park sat near the center of Crest Hollow, bordered by old oak trees whose leaves had mostly fallen. A stone veterans memorial stood near the entrance. Small flags surrounded its base. People often stopped there to leave flowers or read the names engraved on the monument. As Griffin stepped out of his truck, his eyes immediately searched the area. Then he saw the dog. It was exactly where he had been the day before, sitting alone beneath the memorial. The German shepherd hadn't moved much at all. Children ran across the grass nearby. A young couple walked past holding coffee cups. An older man tossed breadcrumbs to birds near a bench. The dog ignored all of them. It neither approached nor retreated. It simply sat beneath the monument as though it belonged there, as though it had been waiting. Griffin stood watching for several moments. The animal looked even thinner in daylight. Its coat was rough and faded from age. One ear bent slightly at the tip. Its breathing appeared slow and steady. There was no panic in its posture, no nervousness, just patience. a strange kind of patience. Griffin walked toward a nearby food stand. The owner, Martha Jennings, a 62-year-old widow who operated the small concession cart beside the park, greeted him with a smile. "Morning, Griffin." "Morning, Martha. You look like you're searching for something." He glanced toward the memorial. "Maybe." She followed his gaze. "The old shepherd?" Griffin nodded. "You know him?" Martha shook her head. "No one seems to. He showed up a few days ago. Doesn't bother anyone. Doesn't cause trouble. Has anyone tried helping him?" "Several people." "And?" "He won't go with anybody." Griffin looked back at the dog. The answer didn't surprise him. Martha handed him a package of cooked beef strips. "He might eat these." Griffin paid and thanked her before walking across the grass. The German shepherd noticed him immediately. Its head lifted. Its tired eyes settled on him. But it didn't stand. It didn't move away. Griffin stopped several feet from the monument. Slowly, he crouched down. "It's just food," he said quietly. The dog continued watching. Griffin opened the package and placed several pieces of beef on the ground. Then he stepped back. For a long moment, nothing happened. The dog stared at him, not at the food, at him. The silence stretched between them. Then, finally, the shepherd rose to its feet. Its limp was more noticeable now. One slow step, then another. It approached the food carefully. Griffin felt his heartbeat quicken for reasons he couldn't explain. The dog lowered its head and began eating. Not greedily, not like a starving stray. It ate slowly, methodically, as if manners still mattered. As Griffin watched, something caught his attention. A strip of worn leather hidden beneath the dog's fur. A collar. His eyes narrowed. The collar looked old, very old, weathered by years of exposure. The dog shifted slightly while eating, revealing a small metal tag hanging beneath the leather strap. The tag was dark with rust, almost completely hidden. Almost. Griffin took an unconscious step forward. The dog paused but didn't retreat. Carefully, Griffin reached toward the tag. His fingers brushed against cold metal. The shepherd remained still. For some reason, it allowed him. Griffin swallowed hard. Then he rubbed away years of dirt and corrosion with his thumb. At first, only a few letters appeared. Then more. The world seemed to narrow around him. The sounds of the park faded. The voices disappeared. The wind vanished. There was only the tag. Only the words. Axel. Griffin stopped breathing. His hand froze. Slowly he turned the tag. More lettering appeared beneath the rust. Property of S. Merritt. The package slipped from his fingers. It hit the ground beside him. He barely noticed. His entire body felt numb. No, that wasn't possible. His eyes returned to the tag. Axel. The name stared back at him. The same name, the same dog, the same German shepherd that had belonged to Stellan Merritt. A memory exploded inside his mind. Black smoke. Alarms. Chaos. The final moments of Operation Black Ridge. Griffin remembered shouting, remembered orders, remembered confusion. Most of all, he remembered seeing Stellan. The young soldier had been separated from the team during the evacuation. Griffin could still hear himself yelling his name, still hear the distant echo coming back. Then he remembered Axel. The dog had broken free, ignoring commands, ignoring danger, running straight back toward his handler, straight back toward Stellan. Griffin had watched it happen. He had watched the shepherd disappear into the smoke. Nobody had expected either of them to survive. The official reports later confirmed what everyone already believed. Stellan was dead. Axel was presumed lost. The story had ended there, or so Griffin thought. His knees suddenly felt weak. Slowly he lowered himself to the grass. The dog finished eating. Then it lifted its head. Their eyes met again. This time everything was different. The tired eyes, the faded fur. The limp, the age. They all made sense now. 8 years. 8 years had passed. The young working dog Griffin remembered was gone. Time had done what time always does. Yet somehow, Axel was here, alive, real. Griffin's hands trembled. He reached out carefully. For a moment, he feared the shepherd would pull away. Instead, Axel remained perfectly still. Griffin rested a hand against the side of the dog's neck. The fur was coarse beneath his fingers. Warm. Alive. His throat tightened. "Axel," he whispered. The dog's ears twitched. The reaction was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, recognition. Griffin felt something crack deep inside his chest. Not pain, not exactly. something older, something buried. For 8 years, Stellan Merritt had existed only in memories, only in silence, only in things Griffin tried not to think about. But now, a piece of that lost world sat directly in front of him. Breathing, watching, waiting, Axel slowly raised his head. His golden eyes remained fixed on Griffin. There was no excitement in them, no joy, only the quiet gaze of someone who had traveled a very long road and somehow survived it. Griffin stared back. For the first time in 8 years, he no longer felt like the last person who remembered Stellan Merritt, because sitting beneath the veterans' memorial was another survivor, another witness, another soul carrying the same forgotten story. And as Axel looked into his eyes, Griffin had the strange feeling that the old dog had finally found the person he had been searching for all along. The drive back to Griffin Cole's house was quiet. Axel lay in the back seat of the pickup truck without making a sound. He did not look out the windows. He did not move around. Every few minutes, Griffin glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting the old German shepherd to disappear like a dream. But each time he looked, Axel was still there, real, alive. 8 years had passed since the day Griffin had watched the dog disappear into smoke and chaos alongside Stellan Merritt. For 8 years, he had believed there was no one left who truly remembered what happened during Operation Black Ridge. Now that belief was beginning to crack. The road wound through the outskirts of Crest Hollow before reaching Griffin's property. His house sat alone near a stretch of woodland outside town. It was modest and quiet, exactly the way he preferred it. There were no neighbors close enough to ask questions, no visitors, no unexpected conversations. The truck rolled to a stop in the driveway. For a moment, Griffin remained behind the wheel. He wasn't sure what happened next. Bringing Axel home had felt like the only possible choice. Yet now that they had arrived, he realized he had not thought beyond that decision. Eventually, he opened the door and stepped outside. The cold afternoon air carried the scent of pine trees and damp earth. Griffin walked around to the passenger side and opened the rear door. Axel slowly climbed out. The old dog paused beside the truck. His joints appeared stiff. His movements were slower than Griffin remembered. Age had taken its toll. Still, there was dignity in the way Axel carried himself. Griffin waited. Most dogs would immediately begin exploring unfamiliar surroundings. They would investigate scents, circle the yard, or inspect the house. Axel did none of those things. He simply stood still. Then he started walking, not toward the front door, not toward the yard, not toward the woods, toward the detached garage behind the house. Griffin frowned. The garage had once been his favorite place. Years ago, it had served as a training space. Equipment had been stored there. Leashes, harnesses, medical kits, and supplies for military working dogs had filled the shelves. After Black Ridge, Griffin had stopped using most of it. Many things remained exactly where they had been left. He followed Axel across the gravel driveway. The old shepherd never hesitated, never paused, never looked around. He moved with quiet certainty, as if he knew precisely where he was going. The garage door stood partially open. Axel stepped inside. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight that entered through the windows. Old tool cabinets lined one wall. A workbench occupied the far corner. The room smelled faintly of motor oil and old wood. Griffin remained near the entrance, watching, waiting. Axel continued forward. Then he stopped. The shepherd lowered himself onto the concrete floor, slowly, carefully, and lay down. Griffin felt his stomach tighten, because of where the dog had chosen to rest. Not near the entrance, not beside the workbench, not in a random spot. The exact corner, the exact place. 8 years ago, that corner had belonged to Axel, back when Stellan was alive, back when all of them still believed they had a future. Griffin stared. His mind drifted backward. He could almost see them again. Stellan sitting cross-legged on the floor while cleaning equipment. Axel stretched out beside him, the young soldier talking constantly, whether anyone listened or not. Sometimes telling stories, sometimes making jokes, sometimes talking directly to his dog. Griffin remembered entering the garage one evening after training and finding Stellan leaning against the wall, with Axel asleep across his boots. "You know what the problem is?" Stellan had said. Griffin had raised an eyebrow. "What problem?" "Everyone thinks he's my partner." He scratched behind Axel's ears. "But really, I'm his." Griffin had laughed. The memory hit harder now than it had then. The garage suddenly felt smaller, quieter, emptier, except for Axel. The old dog rested his head on the floor, exactly where he used to years ago, as though no time had passed, as though he had simply returned after a long mission. Griffin slowly walked closer. His chest felt tight. Not from shock, not from grief alone. Something deeper, something he had spent years refusing to face. He crouched near the dog. Axel opened his eyes briefly, then closed them again. Comfortable, certain, home. The word echoed through Griffin's mind. Home. How had Axel found him? How had he survived? Where had he spent 8 years? Questions crowded his thoughts. Yet none of them felt as important as the realization beginning to take shape, because the dog's actions made one thing painfully clear. This wasn't coincidence. Axel hadn't wandered randomly into Crest Hollow. He hadn't accidentally arrived at the Veterans Day ceremony. He hadn't accidentally found Griffin. The old shepherd remembered. He remembered places. He remembered people. He remembered the life that had been stolen from him. Griffin sat down against the nearby wall. The concrete floor felt cold beneath him. For several minutes, neither man nor dog moved. Silence filled the garage, the kind of silence Griffin had known for years. Yet this silence felt different, less empty. His eyes settled on Axel, the worn muzzle, the faded coat, the scar near one shoulder, the limp. Every mark told a story no report had recorded, a story no official investigation had ever bothered to ask about. Everyone had accepted that Black Ridge was finished. Everyone had moved on. Everyone except those who had lived it. A slow realization settled over him. The military records were gone. Witnesses were gone. The team had scattered across the country. Memories faded. People forgot. That was how the lie survived. That was how Callaway Voss continued standing on stages and speaking about honor, because nobody remained to challenge the story. Nobody except Griffin. And now, Axel. Griffin looked toward the old shepherd. The dog was still resting quietly, not asking for attention, not demanding care, not behaving like an animal seeking rescue. That thought stopped him. He had spent the entire day thinking he had saved Axel. The truth felt very different now. Axel had not come here because he needed saving. He had come here because he remembered, because he carried something no one else carried anymore. Proof that the past still existed. Proof that Stellan Merritt had existed. Proof that Black Ridge was not the story people had been told. For the first time since the ceremony, Griffin finally understood what had unsettled him when he saw the dog staring at Callaway Voss. The look in Axel's eyes had not been confusion. It had not been fear. It had been recognition. The same recognition Griffin felt every time he saw the man on a stage. The same memory. The same wound. Slowly, Griffin lowered his head into his hands. For years, he had believed he was the last witness, the last keeper of a story nobody wanted to hear. Now, he knew he had been wrong. Across the garage, Axel opened his eyes and looked at him. The old shepherd said nothing. He didn't need to. His very existence was enough. And for the first time, Griffin understood why the dog had come back. Not for shelter, not for food, not for comfort. Axel had returned because he was the last witness still alive, the final living witness of Operation Black Ridge. Morning light filtered through the windows of Griffin Cole's house, but he barely noticed it. He had slept only a few hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same things. The rusted tag hanging from Axel's collar, the corner of the garage where the old German shepherd had chosen to lie down, the face of Stellan Merritt, frozen forever at 22 years old in Griffin's memory. When Griffin entered the kitchen, Axel was already awake. The old shepherd lay quietly near the back door. He lifted his head when Griffin appeared, then settled again without making a sound. The house felt different, not because anything had changed physically, because for the first time in 8 years, Griffin no longer felt completely alone with his memories. He poured himself coffee and carried the mug into the small office attached to the house. Dust covered part of the desk. A laptop sat in the corner beneath stacks of old paperwork. Griffin rarely used it except for work. Today was different. He sat down and opened the computer. For several minutes he stared at the screen. Then he typed 2 words, Black Ridge. Hundreds of results appeared. Articles, interviews, awards, military commentaries, profiles. The same story repeated over and over. Operation Black Ridge had become a symbol of courage and leadership. Most versions of the story focused on one man, Callaway Voss. Griffin opened the first article, then another, then another. Hours passed. Every report described Calloway as the commander who had saved lives under impossible conditions. Every article praised his decisions. Every interview repeated the same narrative. Griffin felt his jaw tighten, not because the articles praised Calloway, because they erased everyone else. He searched for another name, Stellan Merritt. Nothing. A few unrelated results appeared, none connected to Black Ridge, none connected to military service, none connected to the operation that had cost him his life. Griffin leaned back in his chair. His chest felt heavy. How was that possible? A young soldier had died during the mission, a man who had risked everything to protect his team. Yet, there was almost no trace of him. He tried another search. Axel? Nothing. No mention of a military working dog. No mention of a handler. No mention of the animal who had served alongside the team. It was as if Axel had never existed, as if Stellan had never existed, as if history had simply decided they were inconvenient details. The hours continued passing. Griffin opened archived news broadcasts, recorded interviews, old television segments. Again and again, Calloway appeared on the screen. Older now, more polished, more confident. The years had transformed him into a respected public figure. In one interview, he spoke about sacrifice. In another, he discussed leadership. In a third, he described the importance of never abandoning teammates. That sentence made Griffin stop the video. Never abandoning teammates. The irony was almost unbearable. He stared at the frozen image on the screen. For a moment, he considered shutting the laptop. That was what he had done for 8 years. Look away. Move on. Stay silent. It had always seemed easier, but now Axel was sleeping in his garage. Now there was another witness. And somehow that changed everything. As evening approached, Griffin finally closed the laptop. The room had grown darker around him. The house was silent. He stood and walked toward the garage. When he opened the door, Axel remained in the same corner. The old shepherd lifted his head. His eyes followed Griffin. Nothing more, no barking, no excitement, only quiet attention. Griffin sat down on an old wooden stool nearby. For several minutes, neither of them moved. The silence between them felt familiar, not uncomfortable, just honest. The kind of silence shared by those who carried things words could not easily explain. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, memories filled the space. Griffin found himself looking around the garage, the workbench, the shelves, the old equipment. Every corner seemed connected to another memory. A conversation, a training session, a joke Stellan once told, a moment he had spent years trying not to revisit. He looked back at Axel. The old dog watched him patiently, the same way he had watched him in the park, the same way he had watched the stage during Veterans Day, the same way he had watched Calloway. Finally, Griffin spoke. His voice sounded quieter than he expected. "Why did you come back?" Axel blinked slowly. The question hung in the air. Why now? Griffin rubbed his hands together. "I thought you were gone." The dog remained silent. Of course he did. He was a dog. He couldn't explain where he had been, couldn't explain how he had survived, couldn't explain what had happened after Black Ridge. Yet Griffin found himself asking anyway. Because for years he had carried questions nobody could answer, questions that never stopped. Questions that followed him into every Veterans Day ceremony and every sleepless night. Axel shifted slightly. Then something unexpected happened. The old shepherd rose to his feet. Slowly, carefully. His movements showed every year of his age. He crossed the short distance between them. Then he lowered himself beside Griffin. Not across the room, not back in the corner, beside Hamriram. For a moment Griffin simply watched. Then Axel gently rested his head on Griffin's knee. The gesture was small, simple, familiar. 1,000 memories returned at once. Axel had done the same thing years ago, whenever Stellan was upset after a difficult training day. He had done it after exhausting missions. He had done it whenever words were unnecessary. Griffin swallowed hard. His hand moved almost automatically. He rested it on the dog's neck. The fur was rough beneath his fingers, real, warm, alive. For several moments, neither moved. The weight of Axel's head remained against his knee, steady, comforting, present. Something inside Griffin shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough for him to recognize it. For years he had convinced himself there was no point fighting anymore. The truth was buried. The witnesses were gone. The world had moved on. He had accepted defeat long ago. Yet now one witness remained. One survivor remained. One living connection to Stellan remained. Axel could not speak, could not testify, could not tell the world what happened, but his very existence challenged the story everyone believed. Griffin looked down at the old shepherd. Axel's eyes met his. Calm, steady, certain. And for the first time in 8 years, Griffin realized something surprising. He was tired of surrendering, tired of walking away, tired of letting silence decide the ending. The feeling settled quietly into his chest. Not anger, not revenge, something stronger, resolve. He rested his hand on Axel's shoulder and exhaled slowly. The old dog stayed exactly where he was. And for the first time since Black Ridge, Griffin no longer felt the urge to quit. The following morning, Griffin Cole stood in his kitchen, holding a folded piece of paper. The number written on it had remained untouched for 8 years. Nora Merritt. For most people, it was just a phone number. For Griffin, it felt like a doorway he had spent nearly a decade avoiding. He looked through the window toward the garage. Axel was resting inside his familiar corner. The old German shepherd seemed peaceful, but his sudden return had changed everything. Questions that Griffin had buried for years were rising back to the surface. He looked down at the number once more. Then he picked up the phone. The line rang only once. Hello? The voice was older than he remembered, but unmistakable. Nora? A brief silence followed. Then came a calm answer. Griffin. He closed his eyes. 8 years had disappeared in a single moment. Nora Merritt was 68 years old. She lived alone in the small town where she had raised her son. Before retirement, she had worked as a high school librarian. She had always been patient, thoughtful, and stronger than people realized. I didn't expect you to answer that quickly, Griffin said. Nora let out a faint laugh. I've been waiting for this call for a long time. The words settled heavily between them. Griffin glanced toward the garage again. Axel came back. I know, Nora replied. His brow furrowed. You know? I always believed he would. Griffin didn't know what to say. For years he had accepted the official story. Stellan was gone. Axel was gone. The mission was over. Apparently Nora had never accepted any of it. An hour later, Griffin was driving toward her house with Axel lying quietly in the back seat. The road wound through rolling hills and stretches of farmland before reaching a quiet neighborhood outside town. Nora's small white house stood at the end of a tree-lined lane. Time had aged the property, but it remained well cared for. When Griffin parked, Nora was already standing on the porch. She didn't wave. She didn't rush forward. She simply stood there watching, as if she had known this day would eventually arrive. Griffin stepped out of the truck. Axel followed. The old dog paused for a moment. Then he looked toward the porch. Nora's composure finally broke. Her hand rose to cover her mouth. Not because she was surprised, because seeing him made hope real. Slowly, Axel walked toward her. His limp was noticeable, but he never hesitated. Nora knelt despite her age. When Axel reached her, she wrapped her arms around his neck. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Griffin looked away to give her privacy. When he finally looked back, tears were running down her cheeks. Hello, old boy, she whispered. Axel rested his head against her shoulder, like he remembered her too. Eventually, they entered the house. The living room looked much the same as Griffin remembered. Family photographs covered the shelves. Several included Stellan at different ages, a teenager in a baseball uniform, a high school graduate, a young soldier smiling beside Axel. The sight made Griffin stop. He hadn't seen some of those photographs in years, Nora noticed. I never took them down. I can see that. Neither did I stop waiting. Griffin sat down. Axel settled beside him. For a few moments, nobody spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt necessary. Finally, Nora stood. Wait here. She disappeared down a hallway. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a wooden box. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a small suitcase. The edges were worn from age. The lid bore scratches and marks from years of handling. Nora carefully placed it on the coffee table. Then she sat down opposite Griffin. I think this belongs to you now. Griffin stared at the box. What is it? Nora folded her hands together. Everything Stellan left behind. The room suddenly felt smaller. Slowly, Griffin opened the lid. The first thing he saw was a notebook. Its cover was faded and worn. Stellan's handwriting filled every page. Training notes, personal thoughts, daily observations, memories. The next item was a bundle of letters tied together with string. Letters addressed to family members, letters written before deployments, letters written during training, letters filled with the ordinary details of a young man trying to stay connected to home. Beneath them sat a digital recorder. Nora picked it up. He used to record voice notes. Griffin turned it over in his hands. The device looked ancient, yet somehow it felt more valuable than anything else in the room. There were also folders, pages of notes, handwritten observations, timelines, dates, records. The deeper Griffin looked, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't simply a collection of memories. It was evidence, carefully preserved evidence. Nora watched him quietly. I started collecting everything after the official report came out. Griffin looked up. You never believed it. No, her answer came immediately. Not for a single day. She leaned back in her chair. My son knew right from wrong. If something about Black Ridge bothered him enough to write all of this down, I paid attention. Griffin opened one folder. Inside were pages describing events surrounding the mission. Names, locations, decisions, details that never appeared in public reports. Details that painted a very different picture. His pulse quickened. The official story claimed Calloway's leadership had saved the team. These notes suggested something else entirely. Again and again one name appeared. Stellan Merritt, the young soldier who had remained behind. The young soldier who had protected the evacuation. The young soldier whose actions allowed others to escape. Griffin continued reading. Each page made the truth harder to ignore. By the time he finished the final document, his hands were trembling, not from anger, from certainty. For years he had carried fragments of memory, pieces of a story. Now those pieces were sitting in front of him, organized, recorded, preserved. Nora looked toward Axel. The old shepherd rested quietly at Griffin's feet. Stellan trusted him more than anyone, she said softly. Griffin nodded. I know. He also trusted you. The room fell silent again. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Inside, Griffin looked down at the box, the journals, the letters, the recordings, the notes. 8 years ago, someone had buried a name. Someone had buried a hero. But Nora Merritt had refused to let the truth disappear. And now that truth sat open on the table between them, waiting. A year passed. The seasons turned as they always did in Crest Hollow. Winter gave way to spring. Spring faded into summer. Summer surrendered to autumn. During that year, Griffin Cole spent countless hours reviewing every page Nora Merritt had entrusted to him. The journals were authenticated, the recordings were examined, the handwritten notes were verified against surviving mission records. Piece by piece, the story hidden beneath Operation Black Ridge emerged into the light. It did not happen quickly. Truth rarely did. Some people refused to listen. Others doubted. But facts have a stubborn way of surviving when enough honest people are willing to examine them. One of those people was Dex Callahan. Dex Callahan, 50 years old, was an investigative journalist known for pursuing stories others preferred to ignore. He had spent most of his career uncovering corruption, exposing false narratives, and documenting forgotten truths. When Griffin first contacted him, he had been skeptical. Then he read the evidence. Then he listened to the recordings. Then he studied the timelines. After that, he stopped questioning whether there was a story. The only remaining question was how long the truth had been buried. Now another Veterans Day had arrived. The same town, the same square, the same ceremony. But nothing felt the same. Morning sunlight stretched across the streets of Crest Hollow. American flags fluttered from storefronts. Residents gathered around the memorial square. Families arrived carrying folding chairs. Veterans greeted old friends. 1 year earlier, Griffin had stood at the edge of the crowd. Today he walked directly toward the center. Axel moved beside him. The old German shepherd was slower now. Age had continued its quiet work. His muzzle was almost entirely gray. His limp was more noticeable. Some days he slept longer than before, yet there remained something noble in the way he carried himself. His head stayed high. His eyes remained alert. And whenever Griffin walked beside him, Axel matched his pace as best he could. People noticed. Some recognized the dog from local stories that had quietly spread throughout the year. Others simply stepped aside as the old shepherd passed. Griffin carried a leather folder beneath one arm. Inside were copies of the verified documents. Verified timelines, authenticated statements, evidence no longer based on memory alone. evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Ahead of him walked Dex Callahan, carrying a small messenger bag filled with notes and recording equipment. The journalist had arrived in town the previous evening. By the following morning, his article was already prepared for publication. It would be released the next day. Veterans Day. 8 years late, but finally coming. The ceremony began exactly on schedule. Local officials gave brief remarks. A choir performed patriotic songs. The crowd applauded. Griffin listened quietly. He felt no anger, no nervousness, only calm. The strange kind of calm that arrives after carrying a burden for too long. Eventually, the announcer introduced the featured speaker, Callaway Voss. Applause filled the square. Callaway emerged from behind the stage with the same confidence Griffin remembered. At 59 years old, he remained a respected public figure. His speeches still drew attention. His reputation still opened doors, at least for now. He approached the podium, smiling, waving, accepting the admiration of the crowd. Then his eyes moved across the audience. At first, nothing changed. His gaze traveled from one face to another. Then it stopped. On Griffin. The smile faded slightly, not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Griffin. For a second, neither man looked away. 8 years of silence stood between them. 8 years of avoided questions. 8 years of missing names. Then Callaway's eyes shifted downward, toward the dog standing beside Griffin, toward Axel. The transformation was immediate. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just unmistakable. Color drained from his face. His shoulders stiffened. His expression froze. For the first time since Griffin had known him, Callaway looked genuinely unsettled. Because Griffin's presence could be explained. Griffin was a former teammate, a man with opinions, a man with memories. People could dismiss memories. They often did. But Axel was different. Axel was not supposed to be standing there. Not after 8 years. Not after official reports. Not after all the stories that had followed. The old German shepherd stood quietly beside Griffin, watching, waiting, existing. Sometimes existence alone becomes evidence. Callaway quickly recovered his composure. Years in public life had taught him how to hide discomfort. The speech continued. Words about sacrifice. Words about service. Words about courage. The crowd listened politely, yet Griffin noticed subtle changes, small hesitations, brief pauses. Moments where Callaway's eyes drifted back toward Axel. The old shepherd never looked away. Neither did Griffin. Dex noticed it too. The journalist stood nearby taking mental notes, observing, recording details the way experienced investigators always did. When the speech ended, applause filled the square once again. This time Griffin did not leave. 1 year ago he would have disappeared before the crowd dispersed. 1 year ago he would have driven home carrying another burden of silence. Not today. He remained exactly where he stood, beside Axel, beside Dex. The three of them watched people move through the square. Some approached to greet Callaway. Others visited the memorial. The ceremony gradually transitioned into conversation and social gatherings. Still Griffin remained. The leather folder rested beneath his arm. The evidence remained secure. The article remained ready. The truth remained alive. And beside him stood the reason he had finally found the courage to act. Axel shifted slightly and sat down. The movement was slow, careful. Age showed in every motion. Yet when he settled beside Griffin, his posture remained proud. The same posture Griffin remembered from training fields long ago. The same posture Stellan used to praise. For a moment Griffin looked down at him. A quiet memory surfaced. Not of Black Ridge, not of loss. Of a young soldier laughing while a younger Axel chased a training toy across a field. A simple memory. An ordinary memory. The kind history never records. The kind that matters anyway. Griffin rested one hand gently on the dog's shoulder. Axel looked up. Their eyes met. And Griffin understood something clearly. Documents mattered. Recordings mattered. Witness statements mattered. But none of them would have existed without the old dog sitting beside him. People can bury paperwork. They can hide reports. They can rewrite stories. They can erase names. What they struggle to erase is a living witness. A witness who survives long enough to come home. The truth finally came out the following morning. By sunrise, Dex Callahan's investigation had been published across multiple news outlets. The article spread quickly. What began as a local story soon reached audiences far beyond Crest Hollow. Veterans read it. Journalists discussed it. Military historians examined the documents. Former members of the Black Ridge team came forward to verify details they had remained silent about for years. For the first time, the public saw the complete story. Not the version repeated in speeches, not the version printed in official summaries. The real one. The verified records, the journals preserved by Nora Merritt, the personal recordings, and the witness accounts, all pointed toward the same conclusion. Stellan Merritt had not been a minor figure in the operation. He had been the reason others survived. His actions during the final stage of Black Ridge had allowed the rest of the team to escape. His courage had been omitted. His sacrifice had been buried, and his name had nearly disappeared from history. Nearly, but not completely, because one mother refused to throw away a box, because one former teammate refused to stop searching, and because one old German shepherd found his way home. Over the following days, the story continued to grow. News programs covered the investigation. Veterans organizations issued statements. Public pressure mounted. Callaway Voss attempted to defend himself at first. He gave interviews, released statements, repeated familiar explanations, but facts proved difficult to argue with. Too many documents matched. Too many timelines aligned. Too many witnesses confirmed the same events. Within weeks, the consequences arrived. Callaway resigned from public office. The man who had spent years standing behind podiums and accepting praise quietly disappeared from public view. Yet Griffin Cole discovered something unexpected. He did not feel satisfaction. He did not feel victory. For years he had imagined this moment. He had imagined what it would be like if the truth finally emerged. The reality felt different, because the story had never truly been about Callaway. It had always been about Stellan. One afternoon, Griffin received a phone call from Nora Merritt. Her voice sounded lighter than it had in years. "The review board approved it," she said. Griffin sat silently for a moment. He already knew what she meant. Stellan's service record had been corrected. His actions had been formally recognized. His contribution to Black Ridge had been restored. The record would finally reflect the truth. When the call ended, Griffin remained seated at his kitchen table for a long time. Axel rested nearby. The old shepherd had become slower in recent weeks. His walks were shorter. His naps were longer. Sometimes Griffin caught himself watching the dog with quiet concern. Time had waited 8 years for Axel. Now it seemed determined to catch up. Several weeks later, on a calm autumn morning, Griffin loaded a familiar object into his truck, an old rubber ball. The surface was worn smooth by age. The faded toy had survived countless training sessions years ago. It had once belonged to Axel, or perhaps more accurately, it had belonged to Stellan and Axel together. Some memories become impossible to separate. Axel climbed into the truck with slow, careful movements. Griffin waited patiently. There was no rush, not today. The drive took them to a memorial cemetery outside town. Rows of markers stretched across a quiet hillside. Tall trees surrounded the grounds. Wind moved softly through the branches overhead. The place felt peaceful. The kind of place where people came to remember rather than mourn. Griffin parked and stepped out. Axel followed. Together they walked along the stone pathway. Their pace matched naturally. Slow, steady, unhurried. Eventually they reached a particular marker, Stellan Merritt. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Griffin looked down at the engraved name. The name no longer felt forgotten. The world knew it now. The record knew it now. History knew it now. Yet somehow, the stone looked exactly the same. The wind stirred gently around them. Griffin reached into his jacket pocket and removed the old ball. He crouched beside the marker, then carefully placed it at the base. A small object. A simple gesture, but somehow it felt right. He remembered Stellan throwing it across training fields. Remembered Axel racing after it with endless energy. Remembered the laughter, the ordinary moments, the moments nobody writes about in official reports. Beside him, Axel slowly lowered himself to the ground. The old shepherd settled next to the marker, then rested his head on his paws, peacefully, comfortably, as though he had finally arrived somewhere he needed to be. Griffin sat down beside him. Minutes passed. Neither felt the need to speak. The silence carried no weight now, no unfinished business, no unanswered questions. For 8 years, Axel had carried a memory that nobody else could see. For 8 years, Griffin had carried a truth nobody wanted to hear. Both burdens had finally reached their destination. Griffin looked toward the horizon. The sky was clear, the air cool. The world moved forward as it always would. Yet something inside him felt different, lighter. Not because justice had been served, not because Calloway had lost his position, not because newspapers had finally printed the truth. Those things mattered, but they were not the most important part. The most important part was simpler. A young man who deserved to be remembered would now be remembered. A mother no longer had to fight alone, and an old dog no longer had to carry the past by himself. Griffin looked down at Axel. The shepherd opened his eyes briefly. Their gazes met. Then Axel closed them again, relaxed, content. For the first time since returning to Crest Hollow, he seemed completely at peace. Griffin smiled faintly. At last he understood something that had taken him 8 years to learn. Some heroes never receive medals. Some heroes never stand on stages. Some heroes never live long enough to tell their own stories. Yet their actions continue shaping lives long after they are gone. And sometimes, the journey back to the truth takes years. Sometimes it takes courage. Sometimes it takes persistence. And sometimes it takes an old German shepherd who refuses to forget the man he loved. The wind moved softly across the hillside. Axel remained beside Stellan's marker. Griffin sat beside them both. And at long last, the truth had found its way home. What makes this story so powerful is that it was never really about exposing a lie. It was about remembering a truth that should never have been forgotten. For 8 long years, Griffin carried a burden he believed he would carry alone for the rest of his life. Stellan Merritt's name was erased from the story. His sacrifice was hidden. His courage went unrecognized. Yet one loyal German shepherd refused to forget. While people moved on, while records changed, and while the world accepted an incomplete version of events, Axel kept carrying the memory of the man he loved. This story reminds us that true heroes are not always the ones standing on the stage, receiving applause or recognition. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names are forgotten, whose sacrifices go unseen, and whose kindness lives on only in the hearts of those they touched. It also reminds us that loyalty is one of the most powerful forces in the world. A loyal friend may not be able to change the past, but they can help make sure the truth finds its way home. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: doing the right thing does not always bring immediate rewards. Sometimes it takes years for the truth to be seen. Sometimes justice arrives late, but that does not make it any less valuable when it finally comes. Thank you for spending your time with us and for joining Griffin, Stellan, and Axel on this emotional journey. We hope this story touched your heart and reminded you of the importance of loyalty, courage, friendship, and remembering those who gave more than they ever received. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you more inspiring stories filled with hope, emotion, and unforgettable animal-human bonds. We look forward to seeing you in the next story.